Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to another episode of Mom Please, the discussion and debate show that spans generations and tries to make sense of everything that's going on in the world. I am your host, representing the millennial viewpoint, Eric Joseph, and I am joined by my lovely co-host, as always, Carol Stram. Hey, Mom, how are you today?
Hey, I'm great today. As you all know, Eric and I are mother and son, and we don't always have the same opinions, and we don't always agree. But we always try to have conversations that are respectful and thought-provoking. And with that, today we would like to discuss birth rates.
Right.
And why they matter. You know, having my baby, what a lovely way of saying how much you love me.
Mom, please, we might get sued for that.
Sorry.
That's like too much, you know? You might get a DMC takedown for that. Okay. Anyway,
the birth rate is the number of births per thousand. It's not the speed at which a baby descends down the birth canal.
I heard that I was pretty fast out of there, though. Set a world land speed record.
Yeah, and you hit like yeah. And because the number of births is represented in thousands, that number is comparable across nations.
Yes.
Right? So the birth rate's also referred to as the Natalie rate. We care about birth rates because a country's population growth, there is the potential there for changing policy decisions concerning health and welfare programs or education or decisions about the economy for each nation. So that's why we care.
Right.
As an example, in 2024, the worldwide birth rate was 17 per thousand.
Okay.
And these numbers sound silly to me, but it's 4.3 births per second.
Okay.
So we just had 4.3 babies and 260 births per minute.
Okay, so just to make sure that I'm clear and that everybody else is clear on this, when you say 17 births per thousand, that's like there are 17 people born for every 1,000 persons in 1 year, right?
Yes,
in like one calendar year?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And this birth rate idea came into play from England in 1856.
Okay.
An example of trending.
Yes.
From 1950, the birth rate was 21.0.
Okay.
75, it goes to 17.5, and 2000, 14.6. Okay,
so we're going down.
We're trending downward.
We're trending downwards, yes.
But why do we even care about that? Because according to the World Economic Forum, birth rate decline actually matters. But when I think about it, I sort of think, well, gosh, if there's less people, there's less difficulty with the planet.
Yeah, I would think so.
Right? The climate is better, infrastructure is better, overcrowding is better. I don't have to stand in long lines kind of thing. You know.
Right.
But economists don't agree with that. They think there's a significant issue with declining populations.
Yeah, I've heard that.
In the U.S., for example, during the 1960s, there were 6 people for every retired person.
Okay.
Today, it's 3 to 1.
Okay, so half.
And by 2035, we expect it to be 2 to 1.
Okay, so we're expecting the number of retired persons to be a much larger portion of our population than it has been in the past.
Right.
Okay.
So as growth dwindles, we have a smaller population. They buy less goods and services. Who pays for health care? Who pays for, in the U.S., Social Security, Medicare?
Right.
And humankind itself just becomes smaller and older.
Yeah.
Okay. So now there's also the concept of the replacement level fertility rate. That's the average number of children a woman needs to replace the population from one generation to the next.
Okay.
That rate is usually considered 2.1. So that means that each female has to have 2.1 children throughout their reproductive years. Now, this rate has to go higher if the female mortality rate goes higher.
Sure.
And sociologists and policymakers have long regarded the idea that this replacement number needs to be sustained in order for the population to be stable.
Okay, well, I mean, that kind of makes sense because if you're having 2.1 children per woman, a woman, I would assume, takes like a man needs to be part of that process. So basically for every 2 people, there needs to be like a little bit more than 2 people to replace them and keep that. Because people be dying for weird reasons and stuff.
Right.
You know, Darwin Awards
Right,
and things.
right.
Licking, electric fences or something like that.
Okay.
Don't do that, by the way. Don't lick an electric fence. It's not a good idea.
Economists think that the replacement level rates decline. The population shrinks, grows old. It slows all the economic growth. It strains government budgets.
Yeah.
Remember, today's babies are tomorrow's workers. Well,
that's kind of depressing.
I know. My grandbaby, who's 18 months, is going to be a worker.
Yeah, she's going to be a taxpayer soon.
Right. She'll, they will work in hospitals, they'll work in businesses, and they will be the taxpayer that supports and funds future social programs.
Right.
Social Security in this country,
Yep.
Medicare in this country.
Yeah.
But not everybody really believes in this doom and gloom kind of thing, that the shrinking population is just awful.
Okay.
There's a professor at the University of Vienna who studies this, Eric Stresning, and he thinks that it's really not a problem. He thinks this is more of a theory, kind of like with the theory of Y2K was going to ruin us in 2000 because computers were going to blow up because they couldn't shift to 2000.
Right. Yeah, they couldn't go to the new millennium.
Right, and that never happened.
That didn't really materialize.
But demographer Warren Thompson theorized that in industrialized nations, people gain access to better health care, sanitation like drinking water. Now, I know that sounds weird to us, but for instance, I visited Peru. Peruvians don't even drink water in Peru. They drink bottled water.
Like the water quality is so bad, it has parasites and things.
So when the death rate drops in a population, more children live to adulthood, and under better conditions, families have fewer children.
Okay.
In the 1960s, the United Nations Population Division adopted this theory, this thinking, and determined in order to have a stable population, there needs to be a child born for every death.
Yeah, that checks out.
Okay.
That checks out.
Now, there's a contributing author to The Atlantic magazine, Stephanie Murray. She says the population does not lead to Armageddon.
Declining population.
Yeah, it does not. The population decline. She posits that 40 years from now, the population will be better educated. Jobs will look way different. Artificial intelligence will help us in many ways. It will improve our productivity and the increased ability to take care of the elderly. And that will allow more women to come into the workforce in highly productive roles. And it will ease the problem of low fertility rates.
Okay.
That's her position.
Okay.
But there's many skeptics on this. For instance, at the University of Massachusetts, Professor Nancy Folbray says, well, what if all those highly educated people want to be rocket scientists and not nursing home workers? How does that solve that issue?
Right.
And then you think about things like what happens to mortgages in a country where there's fewer and fewer houses needed.
I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing. I think that I know that mortgages do represent a significant amount of value for the average person. Like a lot of their net worth is tied up in the value mortgage, of their home. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot of housing shortages in a lot of places, and no homes of any of the correct type or no buildings of the correct type are being built to address this. I don't know if that's as huge of a problem as people think it is. I understand that it might put people like upside down on mortgages and things like that, but maybe the entire housing market deflating as a whole isn't entirely a terrible thing.
Right.
I know that's not a super popular opinion for a lot of people, but
especially people who have houses.
Yes, well, I have one, and I'm okay. Well, anyway.
Okay, so Dr. Christopher Murray, the director of health metrics science at the University of Washington, feels that the below-level fertility replacement that leads to the extinction of the human race.
Yeah.
He has really 3 solutions.
Okay.
He wants to encourage and incentivize women to have more children and careers. So better child care, better parental leave, early childhood education, and higher education for women that will allow them the opportunity to be more involved in the workforce in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And then he also suggests that you invest heavily in people so that everybody is very capable and productive as an adult. The short-term solution that he suggests is bring in migrants. Now, this might sound like this might sound like you're just stealing from one population to bring it to the other.
Another.
But you are depleting populations in those countries.
Yeah.
However, now currently the newest migrant would then be from sub-Saharan Africa, where the population growth is very high and the people can't be taken care of. So that might be a source of future immigration.
I think you're actually even seeing that right now on the southern border of the United States. There is a large migrant influx, and a lot of those migrants are not coming from, say, Mexico. A lot of them are coming from Africa.
Right.
And also a lot of other much more southern South American countries.
Right.
But I have seen that there is a lot more migration from Africa recently.
Right.
For
and
sure.
It seems like...
To the United States, at least.
Right. And we can only speak to that because we're here that. So essentially, though, Eric, as we talk about this, the birth rates are declining, but what's causing that decline? Why is it declining?
Well, it's interesting. So as we see birth rates declining, we have kind of paid attention to the places where it's been happening. And there are a couple of main factors here that are going on. Worldwide, birth rates declining is attributed to women having more freedom.
I have to interrupt you on that. In my mind, it's women being at parity with the opposite sex. But, say it as you will.
Sure. But, in certain places, there's a decline in things such as forced marriages, child marriages.
Child marriages. Tell that to Warren Jeffs, who's the head of, the Church of the Latter-day Saints, incarcerated now for babies being married to men.
Yeah, kind of weird. We don't want that.
No.
There's also more access to things like contraception, condoms, the pill, IUDs, and such. Increased career and socioeconomic opportunities for women, so women don't have to view their kind of ultimate pinnacle of their being as being a mother and embracing that motherhood. That's not like the ultimate end game for a woman anymore. Women at all economic levels are having fewer children as they gain more control of their reproductive rights. So, I think Roe v. Wade's repeal is working in the opposite way of that. And I don't know. I feel like old white guys should maybe stay out
Old white guys should stay out of my reproductive rights.
Yeah, maybe stay out of your uterus.
Stay out of it. The uterus, the womb belongs to me, not you.
Yeah. There's also external factors that are kind of like black swan events, like COVID-19. And this is surprising because people, I think, were joking around a lot about, people are going to be hanging out at home, not doing anything.
Having my baby.
There you go, having their babies. That didn't happen. Now
that's a surprise.
Yeah. Yes and no. We can get into that a little bit later. I think yes and no there. It's a surprise. But today, in a lot of countries, people plan having children. They don't just randomly have them willy-nilly, and they don't want to bring up a child in what looks like a really pessimistic environment. They want to bring up a child in an optimistic and hopeful environment. So that's kind of difficult to imagine when you're in the middle of a world pandemic, a global pandemic.
Right.
So the Brookings Institute estimates that there were 300,000 babies that were not born in the United States that would have been born had COVID not happened over like a 3-year time frame, basically.
Oh my gosh.
Like 100,000 babies per year not born due to the pandemic.
And that's just in the U.S.
And that's just in the U.S.
Wow.
So there has to have been a similar effect, I would imagine, in a lot of places that went through COVID in a similar way.
Right.
So this, this could be a short-term phase thing, once vaccines are a little bit more widely available and once maybe everybody's a little bit more accepting of taking the vaccine, then it won't be as much of an issue. People will start having more kids again, but there has been a definite decline in the amount of children being had because of COVID.
Wow.
It's tough though, because it's kind of that age-old adage. There's never really a right time to have a child.
Right.
It's one of those things
Right.
where
Right.
it's just, you don't know.
Right.
You can't predict so many things. So
Right. Right.
also, things that COVID did, COVID reduced the average lifespan of U.S. citizens by a full year, and it hit different groups differently. Hispanics, for example, average lifespan reduced by 3 years. African Americans, average lifespan reduced by 2 years. So these losses can be viewed as potential parents having children.
Is that related to how many deaths there were amongst those communities?
It likely
probably is,
is.
yeah,
It
okay.
likely is, because I imagine certain communities
Yeah.
which are historically poorer were probably hit much
Harder.
harder by it. So that definitely could play into it.
Right.
More people from those specific demographics
That
probably
makes sense.
passed during the COVID pandemic. From the beginning of the last century, John Ibbitson, author of Empty Planet, The Shock of the Globalized Population, notes that urbanization has been a very significant factor in birth rates. Over the last 60 years, people have been moving from rural areas into urban areas, into cities. In 1960, about a third of the U.S. population lived in a city, but today, I rechecked this. You had 60% in
Right.
your research.
Is it higher?
It's actually 80.1%.
Wow.
Are considered in the United States to live in an urban area. And an urban area counts as any municipality that's over 5,000 people. So that might include
Well,
areas that you might
right.
traditionally think
Right.
of as rural, but
Right.
that number was actually changed recently and included more rural areas than it did before. So that number, it used to be like every municipality over 2,500 people was considered an urban
so
area.
now it's
So now
upped.
it's a bigger number
Right.
that you have to qualify for that. So that kind of still shows you that people are moving to more urban
Right.
areas than rural
Right.
areas.
And what's the issue with urbanization?
Well, urbanization tends to result in families having less children for a number of reasons. One, cities are expensive.
Right.
Cities are more expensive than rural areas generally. You have things in the past, if you think about historically, how things worked. Monarchies, plantations, things like that were all built upon the backs of a huge number of unpaid laborers, slaves, indentured servants. Families had to have more children in order to keep up with the requirement, the agricultural requirement, or the, whatever, it might not have been agriculture, it might have been tobacco, production, or
Right,
cotton
or cotton,
production,
right.
Textiles, right?
Or
They
ranchers.
ranchers,
right.
yeah, ranch hands. They just needed a lot of people. So families necessarily had to be very, very big. Before large cities, most people, right, lived on farms and ranches. They need a lot of kids to work the land.
Right.
The child mortality rates were
Right.
a little bit higher, and
Right.
by a little bit
even,
higher, I mean a lot
right.
higher.
And even
know?
to speak to that, even in this last generation, my parents' generation, they both came from families of 5 children, and both of them had a sibling that did not live to adulthood.
Wow.
So the mortality
Really?
rate now, my generation or my family then
Yeah.
doesn't experience that at all,
Right.
and my kids don't experience that.
Exactly.
So maybe it's medicine, food, however we're living, it's different.
Yes.
And or you don't get trampled on by the horses that you're taking care of, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
We are living to adulthood.
Right.
Okay.
So, back then, I think families just had more kids because the idea was, the children, they want to work. They yearn for the mines, They want to go.
Oh yeah, put your kid in a coal mine.
I mean-
miner's daughter.
I've seen funny things where people who play video games that require a lot of farming and grinding for materials that you might not be super interested in doing, that might be boring. I've seen them hand that controller off to the kid, and the kid's like, "Look at me, Dad! Look at me, dude! I'm doing it."
I can't.
It's great.
I can't say that
Yeah.
I've seen that.
I've seen it. So, another aspect of urbanization that
Right.
isn't just about farming and that is that it creates opportunities for women outside of the home, and they can go and work different kinds of jobs. So urban women are more likely to have an education, a career, and access to contraception. First-time mothers are a little bit older now, and they're having fewer children. In developed countries, the birth rate for women over 40, and this is by the way, this statistic is based on the UK, and I think specifically like Wales in the UK, but in some countries that are developed, the birth rate for women over 40 has surpassed the birth rate for women under 20.
Oh,
And in the US, these numbers are shockingly close. In the US, I think that women over 40 are having about, or are responsible for about 3.7% of the births in this country, whereas women who are under 20 are responsible for about 4.7% of the births. So that number
number's
is
big.
very close. So women are definitely not having kids as early in terms of their own age. The average
So in
number-
other words, you let the woman out of the house and it wrecks all the birth rates.
yeah, I guess so.
Yay!
Well, we want women out of the house, though. What? Mom, please, we want women out of the house.
I know. I'm glad they're out of the house.
Yeah,
That's
good,
all I'm
good.
saying.
Okay,
That's all
just
I'm
making
saying.
sure we're on the same
Okay,
page.
so like when we look at this globally,
Yeah.
we need to look, just to give you a little idea of where this is at by some of the notable countries,
Sure,
right? Okay,
sure.
so in Bangladesh is a great example. Family planning really worked in Bangladesh. So Bangladeshi women are now likely to have no more than 2 children, and they were trying to reduce their rates because they had
overpopulation
big
issues.
numbers.
Okay.
So Jack Caldwell, who's an Australian demographer, noted that in 1999, the Bangladeshi women eagerly took to contraception, whether it's condoms or the pill. They were allowed to have more freedoms, to including work. You know, these were women who didn't traditionally work.
Yeah.
And other countries who also had issues with overpopulation have taken these methods and used them successfully.
Interesting.
Like Ethiopia, Thailand, and Indonesia, all looking to lower their birth rates, have successfully done that.
Oh, interesting. Myanmar is an Asian country that was controlled by its military until 2011, and the military administration wanted the population to double. Burmese women, yeah, they wanted it to twice as much, right? Twice as much. So every Burmese woman has to have twice as many kids as they were having before.
My womb hurts just talking about that.
Yikes. So the Burmese women, they weren't about this. They weren't interested in this policy. And so they enlisted the assistance of like the black market to get contraception, which was smuggled in from Thailand. So that clearly didn't work. You know, there are examples all over the place of countries trying to improve their birth rates, and various levels of agreement from the local population, from the government population.
Okay, so in Iraq, as an example, during post 1990, the Iran-Iraq War created the adoption, because we were there.
Yes.
The adoption of a lot of things from Western culture. So TVs come in and cars, and guess what else? Condoms and birth control pills. So
I thought we imported a lot of heavy munitions and
I think
soldiers to Iraq.
Yeah, I think we did that too. But
that other stuff too.
Talk to George W. about that.
Yeah.
So during that,
he paints pictures of cats now. He's a cool guy.
So during the war, women there had a birth rate of 5.9 per woman.
5.9.
Yeah. And now it's down to 3.2.
Okay.
So
that's still a lot.
It's still a lot.
But
it's
definitely less than 6.
Yeah.
In Turkey, in the last 30 years, birth rates have dropped from 4.07 children per woman to 2.8 children per woman, which is basically exactly where you should be according to all this population
Good
theory,
job,
right?
Turkey.
So good job, I guess, Turkey. In Tunisia, the birth rate dropped from 4.82 to 2.14. Again, another example of a country that's right where it should be. And this is credited to the waning influence of Islam and the Islamic clerics having on the families in these Muslim countries.
That's interesting.
I imagine that they're probably somewhat similar, like fundamentalist Muslim is probably somewhat similar to
like Catholicism,
Right,
where they don't
right.
want
They
you to
want you
use
to have kids,
contraception
right,
and things like
right,
that.
right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of Catholicism, Latin America is a great example of that.
Yep.
So Latin America, which is a completely Catholic environment, they have seen falling fertility rates. I mean, the Vatican has less influence over women there.
Yeah.
And Mexico, El Salvador, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Colombia, Venezuela, and Peru have seen drops in births. So women who historically had 6 kids are now like having 3 kids.
Okay.
This is interesting.
Yes.
40% of the married women who are Brazilian, who have already had their children, are
Okay.
opting for sterilization versus termination of pregnancy or using the pill, because every time they would use the pill and every time they terminate a pregnancy, they would have to confess. You have confession in the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Versus if they get sterilized after they're all
They
done
just
having
confess the
they
one
confess
time.
once and it's all good.
Ah, interesting.
So,
that's a nice little
Yeah.
Catholic loophole there. In sub-Saharan Africa, now this is a part of the world where there are perhaps the highest birth rates in the world, and this is kind of an interesting thing. It's referred to. It's a very poor part of the world, and oddly enough, they have a lot of kids. And you would think, well, kids are expensive. Why would they have so many kids if they're poor? Well, it's that thing again where the available work there, the things that can support them are these heavy, mining industries, farming, things like that, where you need a lot of children to work. And also the death rate, the mortality rate of
Mortality rate's
children
high.
is much higher.
Oh, wow.
And this includes nations like Niger, Mali, Uganda, Zambia, Burundi, sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
The birth rate in Niger, for example, here is 6.49. So
Wow.
that's like 6.5 kids per woman.
Right. And don't
Very
forget,
high.
if you're a famous pop star, you can go and get a
You
kid
can go
from
grab
Mali.
one, yeah. Yeah.
Well, now on the other side of the coin, Taiwan is an example. The birth rate is super low. It's 1.13.
That is quite
It's
low.
very low.
And then flipping back again to another country that has a really, really high birth rate, again, probably due to fundamentalist Islam, is Afghanistan. Afghanistan has the 11th highest birth rate in the world, and the fertility rate there is 4.5 kids per woman.
Wow.
Very high.
That's very high. On the other side of the globe, we have Australia.
Okay.
And they had a low birth rate in the 1960s. They were at 3.14. It began to plummet rapidly, and today it's 1.47. I mean, that's
Okay.
very
yeah,
low.
that's very low.
So in 2004, the government introduced the baby bonus.
Oh, the baby bonus.
Yeah. And so
Right.
they got
Nice.
$3,000 per kid for parents of non-means, meaning
Okay.
parents who didn't have the money to do this on their own.
Sure.
And that rose over time to $5,000. They eventually replaced that with the more politically correct family tax benefit.
All right.
And the model for Australia is to have 3 kids, one for mom, one for dad, and one for Australia.
Crikey. Well, they're doing it.
Those
They're trying
Kiwis.
it.
Those
Yeah.
Kiwis.
Oh, no, the Kiwis are from New Zealand, Mom.
Okay.
You can't get them confused.
Okay, sorry.
That's kind of racist. I don't think it actually is. I don't think
It's
it
a fruit.
is. They are fruits. So, France, going back into the European territories, they have successfully managed to increase their fertility rate from all-time lows. In 94, the birth rate was 1.64 in France. And in 2024, now the birth rate has increased to 1.84. This is partially the result of strong incentive policies. Birth rate family benefits and family coefficient income tax rates have helped. The coefficient tax rate provided that families with 3 kids could basically live as comfortable as childless families.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of evened out the, I think, me and my wife don't have children. We often kind of look at some of our friends who have children, and we feel like we can spend a proportionally more amount of our money
Disposable
on
income,
us, our
yeah,
disposable
right,
income on us, where they can't. But in France, it's basically equivalent between people with kids and people without kids. So,
I love the frogs. They figure stuff out.
Yeah, they have some neat ideas.
Yeah.
They have some neat ideas.
Now in Germany, the fertility rate is 1.58, so also low.
Yes.
And this is predominantly they're pointing to COVID.
Okay.
As the main driver of why it's dropped.
Okay.
And the war in Ukraine, which is right in their backyard,
Sure.
inflation, and the climate crisis. Now,
That one I can understand, the climate crisis.
what's interesting to me about Germany is that if anybody can figure out how to reinvent themselves to a shrinking population, I think
It would be the
I
Germans.
could bet on them, because
Yeah.
they're great with automation. They've done great inroads with figuring out that not every person should be college educated, that they should train people for highly skilled labor, plumbers and carpenters and such that. And
Makes sense. German-made stuff usually is pretty.
yeah,
pretty
right.
nice.
They're good automators. And historically, I think they have dealt with in the last 100 years, they have dealt with their country looking so different
Yes,
than it does
that's
today,
true.
by
That's true.
virtue of World War One
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Two and so forth. So I think I'm going to bet on them if they can
Okay.
figure this out. I'm betting
Okay.
on them.
Italy is another country that has seen a massive decline in births. The current birth rate in Italy is 1.25.
Wow.
So this has become a problem because the costs associated with child rearing and child support and fear of losing one's job, unemployment is rather
Is
high
high.
over there. It's impacted the birth rate. People don't want to have kids if they can't afford the kids.
And so that's an interesting paradox to me, because Italy arguably must be the most Catholic country in the world.
Yeah, you would think.
And
You would think.
Right? And I just looked this up.
The Pope is dead.
Yeah, I just looked up the Vatican stance on
Yes.
birth control,
Yeah.
and you can't do anything if you're a Catholic. I mean,
Yeah.
they are not. They are still standing firm on this. That this is procreation, and that's it.
That's all it's for.
And
Yeah.
it's interesting to me that they're going against the church, obviously, and the average age there is 47.9 years. So they have a very
What?
old population.
People the average age of people is almost 50 years old in Italy. All the young people are leaving.
Yeah, I don't know if
Wow.
they're leaving or they're not, or they're just
Or
not
they're just
reproducing.
they're not
right,
boinking.
right, yeah, yeah. That's one way to put it.
Yeah. Wow.
And
That's
Japan
crazy.
also has the lowest birth rate
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah, I
One
think a
the
lot of
lowest.
people hear about this.
1.3. And surveys show that younger Japanese people are reluctant to marry and reluctant to have children because the job prospects are so bleak.
Yeah.
There's a high cost of living, and job opportunities, their culture, their corporate culture is very gender biased.
Yeah.
So there probably aren't as many opportunities for women. It places a lot of burden on, the mothers to be completely responsible for any children.
Yeah.
And
And like the family too, right?
Yeah. And by 2035, it's expected that only 1 in 4 Japanese, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. It's expected that 1 in 4 Japanese will not marry. So that's a big number. And these adults are characterized by sociologist Mishura Yamada as the parasite single because they still live at home with mom and dad.
They still live at home with their parents.
Yeah. Cost of living's high.
Yikes. Other Southeast Asian nations are also kind of struggling as well. One that people hear less about because I think their cultural influence is so great is South Korea. South Korea, if you do a deep dive on what's going on over there, it is quite bleak, actually. The average number of children per woman is now 0.72.
Wow.
Which we know 2.1 is needed for replacement rate. In just 2 generations, there will apparently be only 6 grandchildren for every 100 Koreans that are alive today.
That's a lot of grandmas and grandpas to take care of very few kids.
Yes, basically nobody take care of all these aging people. The government is offering 100 million won, which is the equivalent of $72,000 US dollars.
Oh, that's a lot of money.
Per child. And the government has already spent $217 billion US combating this birth rate issue.
with
Wow.
basically no effect. With basically no effect. So, if you like Korean things, that's going to be a problem for you in the future. That means like no more BTS, no more Squid Game, no more Singles Inferno, Physical 100, no more Samsung products, TVs, microwaves, refrigerators, no more Kias, no more Hyundais, no more Genesis cars, less competition in video game esports, which for some people I'm sure that's fine. No computer chips. Well, not no computer chips, but fewer computer chips. It's one of the major exports of South Korea. Like things like TV screens, computer monitors. There's going to be a massive supply shortage of these kinds of products.
Why is that happening, though? Why is it happening?
Well, it's mostly due to, there's a couple of things kind of working in tandem here. South Korea, kind of all those Southeast Asian nations like Japan, South Korea, and China, historically have had a lot of influences from Confucian ideology, Confucian thought process. And Confucius basically prioritized the state, the harmony of the state, over the self. So your entire purpose is basically to your country, to your state. And that kind of thinking permeates every aspect of Korean society
Culture, right.
and culture. And Korea didn't really have a lot of exterior influences coming in aside from that to temper that kind of philosophy and that kind of thinking. And what that's resulted in is things like absolutely insane work culture, where you're required to be in the office for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Like super, super strict gender roles, especially for women, where they have to deal with things like they have to be faithful to their husband beyond death. So widows couldn't remarry.
What?
Men were allowed to take multiple wives. Women were not allowed to take multiple husbands. Women were basically not allowed to leave the home unless attended by a male. They were not allowed to go to school. In fact, like most Korean women in like as recently as the 1960s were illiterate. The vast majority of Korean women in the 1960s were illiterate. So a lot of these very strict expectations have relaxed, but women are still expected to do things like take care of the husband's family, take care of the household, be completely deferential to the husband in like every aspect. There's advice going around in Southeast Asia right now among the other countries from mothers to their daughters, and they're telling them, you can date a Korean man, don't marry one.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's bleak.
I just read
good.
I just read a book, The Girl with Seven Names, and she ultimately emigrated. She escaped North Korea.
Okay.
And went to South Korea, but she did marry a Brit.
Ah, interesting.
So she didn't. That's interesting. That's interesting. Okay. Now I kind of thought, South Korea had it all together.
I did too. I listen. Trust me. Before I looked into this,
surprises me.
Very surprising, shocking.
I thought North Korea was the problem.
Yeah.
And in 2023, they had the 5th National Meeting of Mothers with Kim Jong-un. He encouraged the mothers to contribute more to stopping the declining birth rate in North Korea.
Okay.
But due to the labor-intensive military and the perpetual lack of resources, including food and whatnot, they have a birth rate of 1.7.
Okay.
What's unusual is that North Korea is one of
South Korea.
Right. North Korea is one of the poorest economies.
Right.
Their annual salary, U.S. American, is $1,100 per year.
Jeez.
Yet they have a birth rate comparable to upper middle class income countries.
That's interesting.
So the research suggests that after the Korean War in the 1950s, North Korea struggled with very scarce resources and aspired to outproduce the U.S.-backed South Korea. So in the 1970s, right? So in the 1970s, North Korea adopts some interesting things. Universal education, and encourages people to marry later, to actually work.
That's interesting.
They provide contraception and legal abortion.
In North Korea.
So by the 1990s, the attempts to ban abortion and severe food shortages just collapse.
Sure. Yeah.
And they're very tied to
to Russia. Right. Soviet Union at the time.
And the Soviet Union collapses as well.
Yeah.
And so they don't get the resources that they were typically getting from Russia.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Or contracts or whatever they were getting. Men are forced into non-paying government work, leaves the women to care for the children and become the breadwinner of the household. So the rising sentiment among North Korean women is that the economic conditions have to change, and if they don't, they will not marry and they will not have children.
I mean, I feel like that's kind of a theme with a lot of these places, is that the economics of having the children is really not good.
Out of the.
I mean, the next place we're going to talk about, Hungary, they haven't exactly been an economic powerhouse for a while, and back in 2010, their birth rate was incredibly, incredibly low. It was about 1.2 births per woman.
Wow, 2010.
2010. Okay. So pretty recent. Now, that's when Viktor Orban comes into power in Hungary as the PM, prime minister, and he starts directing about 5% of the GDP of the country to encourage family formation. And this includes things like tax breaks, low interest loans, free IVF treatment, in addition to other things. So since then, the birth rate has risen to 1.5 per woman. And that's a 25% increase from 1.2 to 1.5.
From 1990 till now?
From 2010.
2010
from
till now.
2010 until now.
That's
so in like a short 15 years, basically, that's been able to change. Now, there's the question of how much is this policy affecting the birth rate, because you have to think there are a couple of things that happened around the 2010 timeframe that could have affected this, like the 2008 global financial collapse.
Right.
Hungary was hit especially hard by this. And you can definitely reasonably assume that when a country is dealing with that much economic hardship, they're not really terribly interested. Not a lot of people are going to have kids. They're not going to bring children into that environment. Now, there are some nice things that they do offer. So one of the most interesting things that I saw was there's a lifetime income tax reduction of 25% per child in Hungary, and that you are allowed to have 4 kids and get that to 100%. So you could be income tax free if you have 4 children for the great country of Hungary.
Huh. Wow.
Not too bad.
Now
not too bad.
This is not encouraging anybody from the U.S. to move to Hungary by any means.
Yeah.
And then also in that area of the world, we have Russia.
Right.
The fertility rate is 1.86. In 1950, it was just under 3. So that's a pretty big decline.
Yeah.
Putin has instituted financial incentives for having children, which are just not working, because Russians themselves have experienced falling incomes.
Yeah.
They are at war now with the Ukrainians.
That's a big part of it.
Before they were at war, they are completely isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah. If I was a Russian person, I would be looking at what's happening right now and be like, if I raise a kid, is my kid in 18 years just going to be sent off to be cannon fodder in some other godforsaken part of the world?
And the poverty's on the upswing.
Yeah.
So it's just not an environment that the average person in good conscience could say, well, let's bring a bunch of kids into this world. Right.
In the UK, in 2022, the birth rate was 1.49 children per woman. So they're not doing super well with that. That's well below the replacement rate. But the UK has also decided to limit immigration, which is kind of the one way you combat a low birth rate. I got a question, and I've heard from some of my friends, how is Brexit really doing for you guys? I don't think it's going so well. I don't think so.
That's just an interesting thing that they did in my mind. And
crazy. That's crazy to me.
I thought the EU, the formation of the EU was so brilliant.
I thought it was pretty bold and interesting.
And these guys just turn around and walk away from it. I don't know. And then we have the good old United States, near and dear to our hearts. Birth rate per woman is about 1.62. Much of this has been directly related to social and economic issues, leading women to having children later in life. There's an increasing change in the priorities of Americans in terms of having children. Pew Research notes that economic difficulties and fertility are linked by race and ethnicity as well in the U.S.
Okay.
So, for instance, Hispanics in the U.S. have the highest birth rates. Maybe due, they're kind of our largest immigrant population, right?
Yeah, Hispanic is definitely the largest immigrant
And
population.
followed by African Americans, then whites, then Native Americans, then Asian Pacific and Islanders, which is
Hawaiians.
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's because these people are coming from countries where they couldn't have children. Like China.
Like China.
Yeah. So births among all these groups have declined, and it's, job loss and loss of wealth. For example, the financial downturn of 2008, Hispanics lost 66% of their wealth.
Wow.
African Americans lost 53% of their wealth, and whites lost 16% of their wealth.
Yeah.
So you could see the impact on families, either having a child or adding to an existing family. It was pretty significant that it would be probably a lot more mothers had to participate in the workforce.
Yeah.
That also lowers the birth rates, effective contraception, and the economic downturn postpones childbearing. And what they've determined is that once you postpone childbearing, it's unlikely that that child ever gets born. Because as you said earlier, there's no perfect time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So fewer immigrants also impact the birth rates.
Okay.
So now when we look at what factors actually increase fertility.
Yeah, what can we do to actually get the fertility rate up?
Some of them might be things you may not want to participate in. Okay. First one, being religious. Okay. So Muslim women, as an example, on average have 2.9 children.
Okay.
Versus Christians who have 2.6. So it also is affected by the age of that population.
Sure.
So I believe this refers to the United States.
Yeah.
In the United States, the average Muslim is 24 years old of childbearing age, and Christians are 32.
Man, that is a far cry from that Italian number of 47.9?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's crazy, right?
Wow, that's bad.
And then now we're in an environment today where if you intend to have children, you have them.
Right.
That's very different than my mother's generation.
Yeah.
My grandmother's generation. They got pregnant when they got pregnant. There was very, very little planning.
Yeah.
I'm
sure there was a bunch less education on all that.
Well, and there wasn't,
and not as much access to contraception.
Yeah, I mean, the pill didn't even exist.
Right.
So that has an impact on the whole situation. And then maternal support, your extended family, your community, affordable daycare, early childhood care, education, and so forth. All of that has factors that increase fertility. Factors that decrease fertility are wealth and education. It seems like the more wealth, the more educated, the less children in a family.
Yep.
And increasing age of female pregnancy. And I think the number is when you turn 35, you are considered a geriatric pregnancy if a pregnant woman at that point.
Right.
So
man, that sounds so mean.
35 doesn't. Yeah, I know.
Jeez.
35 doesn't seem that old to me, but the reproductive system of a woman is active literally between the ages of 12, 13, 14.
Yeah.
So we have delayed childbearing. Not that I recommend.
We don't recommend any 12, 13, or 14-year-olds getting pregnant, or 15, or 16, or 17, or 18.
Right. So that's an issue. And then access to family planning. So birth control, the ability to terminate a pregnancy, that decreases fertility. Reproductive health. So if you take away, your ability to reproduce.
You can't.
For a million reasons. I mean, there's lots of things that, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Pregnancy is complicated, right?
Yes.
And then child custody in this country, when they started clamping down on deadbeat dads for payments, it reduced unmarried births by 20%.
It's not surprising.
So the boy slipped on the condom.
The boys, they were like, yeah, I don't want to be financially responsible for 18 years. That's okay.
So
That's all. That all makes sense. I mean, I feel like there's so many factors that go into everybody's individual choice, whether or not they
Sure.
want to have kids or not. And I think, people consider things like economic climate, social upheaval, political tension, environmental issues, like your personal financial situation,
Right.
so many different things when you're thinking about having kids.
Right.
And a lot of these factors, I think for a lot of people seem to be in kind of a negative place today.
right.
So, that could definitely be affecting people's decisions to have children at all.
Right.
A lot of people, as we've said, don't want to bring a kid into a world that seems chaotic, dangerous, and unpredictable.
Right.
Right. They want to have some sort of hope that there is like a guarantee of stability for them and their children. Right. So like what kind of environmental factors have happened, or what other, factors have happened, global factors have happened that have affected this? The 2008 global financial crash, again, we're going to reference that, which was a massive shift in wealth from poor people to rich people.
Right.
The 2020 COVID, like mini economic crisis that happened, was again another massive shift in wealth from poor people to rich people. There are environmental crises that loom worldwide, which, the Paris agreements happened, but it doesn't really seem like anything concrete has come of that. It seems like if anything was really happening, why do we have so many climate change activists like blocking roads and tying themselves to goalposts during soccer matches or to tennis posts during tennis matches to try and gain awareness about the issue?
Right.
We wouldn't have that.
Right.
There's also this I think is really tough for people, is the constant barrage of the 24/7 news cycle just inundating you with negative news constantly to drive viewership. Because nowadays everything is based on what is the most provocative, what can I get the most reactions out of. So it's either like crazy positive content or incredibly negative content
Right.
that is generating the views and the clicks. So we're constantly reminded by the news that the world is unsafe. It's scary. We're told of things like school shootings, Sandy Hook,
Right.
Uvalde,
Right.
our adults actually being scared into not having kids.
Right.
I
know.
wonder.
That's interesting that you say that, because I remember when your brother and his wife told me that they were expecting,
Yeah.
and I was very excited for them. But there was a little bit of my heart that was like, I hope everything will be okay.
I hope it all will be
and
fine.
I don't
Yeah.
mean okay with the baby and the childbirth and everything. I mean okay in a world moving forward,
Right.
where so many things seem so hostile to me right now.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And so I can understand somebody contemplating bringing a child into the world and thinking, how can I keep this child safe?
Yeah, I don't know. It's very hard. So there are a lot of external things that are happening to definitely affect people's decision to have kids, and it's even noted by economists and professors and all sorts of people that it is hard to get people to have kids when they just don't think that having kids is in their either their best interest or in their child's best interest.
Right.
This is a quote from a professor, Trent McNarma at Texas A&M, who's written about fertility rates before. Even the richest, savviest, most committed governments, most tenacious governments have struggled to find policies that produce sustained bumps in fertility over time. If there were, he posits that if these things existed, this wouldn't be an issue, and we would have figured them out by now.
Right.
Right?
Next time on Mom Please.
It is what, in the United States, the right is trying to do to increase childbirth is overturning Roe v. Wade.
Okay. I need to talk about that.
Sure.
Okay. So
Austria grants parental leave up to 2.5 years, which is kind
do
of
you still know how to
wild.
do your job when you go back to it?
If you go back to your job, do you still know the people that you're working with? We've kind of soft talked about why having less people is such a problem.
Right.
But I want to go into a little bit more about what the theories are about this. And keep in mind, these are theories, and I'm going to talk about some of the reverse theories as well. Mainly the problems are economic.
Many people rely on social services and policies. These can be examples like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so on and so forth, pensions.
In this
et cetera.
country, those are our social programs, but in other countries, they have social programs.
They have other things that
like in
would
kind.
also suffer. That goes on here because there are less taxpayers to pay in those social systems that those retirees are then using. So a shrinking economy also just leads to a lack of young workers available to provide, just a lack of workers in general in things like service industries and care industries. Lack of young people to buy goods and services to propel strong economies kind of can create a permanent recession. You get declines in basic services and infrastructure. There's less demand for basic services due to the employment drop because of the falling tax base. Yeah, that's kind of all the bad things it means. And basically, can we even survive in a less consumer-focused society? There's a lot of research out there that says yes.